Good morning. The reading is written in the 20th chapter of Exodus. Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and sets it apart as holy. Honor your father and mother. Then you will live a long, full life in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
Be seated. Well, good morning again. If you're just joining us, great to have you in worship with us this morning. We are in the middle of a series that we are calling The God of Grace, looking at the Old Testament through the lens of grace. We have come this far by looking so far at the creation story, the promise of Abraham and Sarah, which is going to come into play today, and then last week Joseph and his brothers. And so today we now take a look at the story that we have through the lens of grace. Real quick, our running definition of grace for our series is, let's all say it together, the unconditional, undeserved, unearned love of God for sinners with the power to transform lives. It is a love that comes to us unconditionally. God doesn't put any conditions on it. Right? We don't deserve it. And yet there's nothing that we can do to earn it. It comes to us as a gift from God, right? Nothing that we can do to earn it. And a love like that has the power to transform people's lives. So today, we're going to switch gears, and I want us to take a look at the concept of both law and grace through this lens for today, all right? Now, one of the most misunderstood concepts of Scripture, I think, is the relationship between God's law and God's grace. Okay? And one could see why. I mean, if God's law says not to do something and we do it anyway, for many people, do we really expect God to look the other way? For some people, not. But there's been this long-running debate between law and grace, and it goes beyond just the practical. And what happens is that in many areas of theology and many churches in the country today, it quickly comes to a part about a debate about salvation. All right? Because there are those who would argue that the law was given to us to provide us a way of earning our way into God's favor and earning our way into heaven. Is that grace? No. Right? You can't earn it. Nothing you can do to give it. And trust me, I've heard plenty of pastors, I've heard plenty of evangelists on TV argue, right, that you have to earn your way into heaven, that you have to earn your way into salvation, right? And that if a person isn't keeping the law, well, then they simply aren't Christian. I have a big problem with that. All right? Big problem. And there's a battle between those who believe that there has to be an earn your way in theology and those that believe salvation is by faith and grace alone. And then you're left in the middle. Where does that leave us? All right? Because let's face it, the Bible sure has a lot of thou shalt nots. But I know that the Bible talks an awful lot about grace as well. So is it either or is it both and? And can law and can grace both coexist at the same time? I think they can. And I think there's no better way of showing you that than in our text that we have for today on the Ten Commandments. Because here's the deal. This isn't as confusing as people make it out to be. All right? The easiest way to look at this, God's law and God's grace, is just look at this text that we have for today. Look at the text of the Ten Commandments. All right? Now, most everyone has heard of the Ten Commandments. Everybody here heard of them? Yeah? Who here thinks, you know what, yeah, we should probably look at those and abide by some of them? What do you think? Yeah? Absolutely. Here's what gets me, though. We will go to lengths to fight about these things, whether or not they stay in town squares, whether or not they stay in our places of judicial systems, and so many few of us actually know what they are. Can we all sit here and name all 10 just off the top of our heads? I was watching a YouTube video this past week. They went out on the street, kind of like what Jay Leno used to do. And they were like, hey, 10 Commandments. Yeah, they're great. They're wonderful. Yep, we should do those. Okay, what are they? 90% could only get 4. A couple of them could get 5. One guy got to 6. Guess what? They all got the thou shalt nots. All of them. And you know what? I think that says something. I think that says something about the way that we view God, actually. Right? Don't do this, otherwise God's going to get you. Right? And so, what that says to me is that there's a whole lot of obedience gets you in and disobedience keeps you out theology that's out there. And I don't think anything can be further from the truth. Do we do things in order to earn salvation? For the Lutherans, no. We do them because of the grace that is already extended to us. Not because we're trying to earn our way in somewhere. And so I want to look at the context surrounding the giving of the Ten Commandments. Because I believe that it resolves some of the tension between God's law and God's grace. Right? One theologian this week put it, the Ten Commandments do not stand in contrast to grace, but they are introduced within the story of God's grace. All right? And yeah, if you take a look at the immediate story, just right there with the Ten Commandments, it's absolutely plausible that you're only going to see law. But I want us to pan out a little bit and see this in the context of the whole story. See, this is where we get into trouble. We like to take little verses here and there, and we don't like to take the context in which they're written and the bigger story in which they occur. We just like them because they fit what our argument's supposed to be. Right? If you pan out, you will be able to see God's law within the story of God's grace. All right? So, we're going to start off by looking at the Promised Land. Anybody know what the Promised Land is? Promised Land. Why do we call it the Promised Land? Anybody remember? Why do we call it the Promised Land? It was promised to who? Abraham from last week. Remember this? Genesis 15. Right? God said to Abraham. Next slide, real quick. The Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation who enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. What more could a guy ask for, right? After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land. All right, there's the promise. Right, there's the promised land. And sure enough, what God said all the way back to Abraham right here actually came true. All right, we last left off with Joseph and his family where? In Egypt, right? Joseph saved his family from starvation. He brought them to Egypt. This is how Israel gets to Egypt in the first place, all right? They weren't just rounded up and gathered and brought to Egypt. It's because of what Joseph did. Joseph tells his family, I'm going to bring you here and I'm going to take care of you. All right? So many, many generations pass. The people of Israel start to grow. All right? And that makes Pharaoh a little bit nervous. All right? Pharaoh didn't know anything about Joseph. Pharaoh didn't know anything about what had happened. This new Pharaoh. All right? He doesn't know anything about that. You know what he does see? These people are getting to be a pretty big people, and I'm a little worried. Right? What if they attack? What if they decide to take over Egypt? What if? Now, it's predicted that Egypt grew to about 3 million people at this point. Okay? So yeah, he had a little bit of a right to get a little nervous. But here's the deal. They didn't have an official government. They weren't organized. Pharaoh was their king. They had no laws of their own. They had no land of their own. And so what Pharaoh does is he pushes them into slavery. He says, I'm going to control them by making them slaves. So now you have this nation of Israel, if you can call it a nation, in slavery, in captivity. And over the 400 years that they're going to be there, they're going to know captivity, they're going to know oppression, they're going to know poverty, they're going to know hopelessness. That's all they're going to know. And after so long, guess what happens? They totally forget about God. They assimilate into the culture, and they start adopting Egyptian gods and Egyptian superstitions. And after 400 years, God says, that's enough. He rises up a lowly shepherd to go and set them free. This shepherd is Moses, not Charlton Heston, Moses. I know we kind of get it confused sometimes. Moses' objective was to free God's people. Get them out of Egypt, take them back to the land that was promised to Abraham and Sarah. So Moses ends up bringing them out of Egypt. It's the story known as the Exodus, right? Exiting out of Egypt. And then they're out in the wilderness for quite a while. Right? 40 years. And they're in this place what I like to call the land between. It's not Egypt and it's not the Promised Land. They're in between. We have these, by the way, seasons in our life where we're in the land in between as well. We're not quite sure what's going on, but God's teaching us something through that, right? And that's what was happening out there. God was preparing them. God was teaching them. All right? They didn't know anything about how to govern apart from slavery. And so God is using this moment to help mold their identity into a nation. right? And God starts with some rules to live by. And they're not just 10, all right? We always like to focus on the 10, but there's also 600 others, 603. Yeah, try putting that in a courthouse in the middle of the town square, right? Come on, y'all, we can't even memorize 10, right? 603. That's known as the law of Moses. Why is it known as the law of Moses? Moses is the one that gives it to them, right? He's speaking on behalf of God. And there were tons of rules pertaining to diet, sanitation, marriage, children, slavery, property rights, right? What's criminal behavior, what's not criminal behavior, what's the punishment for it, all of those things. And you're probably sitting there scratching your head, you're probably going, 603, that's a lot. Well, but remember, they didn't know anything. They didn't know how to be a nation. They didn't know how to be with one another. They didn't know what it meant to be a people. And so God says, I'm going to give you a prescription on how to conduct yourselves. And it's within that framework that God gives them 10 commandments, right? According to Mel Brooks, it was 15. Moses dropped a tablet, then it was 10. History's still out on that one. But what happens is that these 10 are going to set the tone for the other 603 that follow. And here's the one thing I want you to know. Between the 10 commandments and the 603, not one of them has anything to do with where you're going to spend eternity. And if that's the case, how do we then do this to get you here so easily? None of them have anything to do with where you're going to spend eternity. They are about your relationship with God and your relationship with each other. Goes right back to the creation story that we talked about several weeks ago. And I always say, all right, you can tell a lot about a nation, you can tell a lot about a government, you can tell a lot about a household by the rules they establish. And you can also tell a lot about them by which rules they choose to enforce and they choose not to enforce. And I believe that principle also goes to God as well. God's rules reflect God's values. So what does God value? Well, let's look at the 10 Commandments. All right? Because in them, God not only reassures the people of Israel about God's power, but he also reassures them about the goodness of God. Now, the way that I'm going to take this is I'm going to look at the first 4, because I often believe we forget about the first 4. That was abundantly clear in the YouTube video that I watched. Everybody got 5 through 10 really well. Don't steal, don't kill, don't do this, don't do that, right? They forgot about the first 4. But the first 4 are about the establishment of the relationship with God. And then we've got to start there. Now, I'm going to break this up into 4 versus 6. Luther in the Small Catechism breaks it down 7 and 3. It's just how you divide the first one. Luther combines what I'm about to split into 2. All right? The point is 8, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4, they all add up to 10. All right? So here's where God begins. I am the Lord your God. The most important word in that sentence is what? Your. You know why? Because it establishes relationship. Right? In a time where there were territorial gods, gods that controlled nature, gods that controlled this or that, this signifies a relationship. And God is establishing a personal relationship with Israel. Did they earn it? No. Did they deserve it? No. Look at their behavior out in the wilderness. But something that is unearned and undeserved is what? Grace. It is grace that establishes a personal relationship with people. It is grace that still establishes a relationship with you. Have you earned that relationship with God? Do you deserve it sometimes? Right? And God was telling Moses and the people that they didn't have to do anything to get it. They were already in. Right? God said, I brought you out of Egypt to bring you in to relationship. Right? I brought you out of slavery so that I could bring you in to relationship. This is the same concept of the cross, everybody. By sending Jesus, God says, I bring you out of the slavery to sin so that you can now be in relationship with me once again. And said, God is already in God's plan establishing this principle of bringing out of slavery to bring into relationship with Him. And it's amazing to think about, right? God initiated a relationship before rules were ever established. So if we are already in relationship, what's the one most important thing you have to have in a relationship? Trust. If you don't have trust, you don't have a relationship. And so the first commandment is all about that. Trust. Here it is. You shall have no other gods before or beside me. That's about trust. Why did God have to say that, though? Again, these people lived for years in a land where people surrounded themselves by many gods. And God was saying, no, I want to be your one and only God because I am the one and only. I don't want you to put any of your trust in any of those gods. I want you to put your sole trust into me. And I think I've earned that. Because when you were in the wilderness and you complained about there being no water, I provided water. When you are out in the wilderness and you complained that there was no food, I provided you manna. And then when you complained about the manna that I gave you meat to eat. So I think I've already established some of that trust here. And I'm asking you to trust me. I am the Lord your God. There is nothing else. There's no other gods. Put your trust in solely in me. Then he goes into the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or the waters below. God says, I do not want you to attempt to even replace me with anything. Now, put yourself into their shoes. It's hard enough to worship one God coming from where they come from, but to also worship an invisible God that you can't see. Woo! So of course it was in their nature to say, let's form something to be representative of God. And God says, no. I am unrepresentable. I don't want you to become enslaved to inanimate objects when you have a living God already. Whoa. There's a 21st century message. The things we worship versus worshiping a living God. And it's interesting because while Moses is being given this commandment, guess what's happening down below in the valley? They're already making an idol. They're like, okay, this is great, but we don't know what God looks like, so let's go ahead and form God into an image, right? Next commandment, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. This is one of the most misunderstood commandments. When we see this one, we automatically think, don't say things like, oh my God. Or when we hit our thumb, we say, God. Right? Not what this commandment is about. Let's look at the Hebrew in order to understand this. The most sacred name is represented in Hebrew with only 4 consonants. YHWH. Can you say a name without vowels? No. In other words, God's name is so holy you can't even say it. That's what the Hebrew was getting at, right? And no one has spoken this name in so many centuries. Even if you ask them what vowels to put in there, they would tell you they don't even know. Okay? We, in Western society, put vowels in there, an A and an E, Yahweh, right? But even today, if you visit some Jewish sites and synagogues, you will still see that, or you'll see the one underneath it. Now again, contrary to what we are taught, this is not about when you hit your finger saying God's name. It goes deeper than that. If we really go deep into the Hebrew here, it's more like this. Do not attach God's name to something God has not attached it to himself. Do not leverage the name of God in order to accomplish your own goals. How have we done on that? Crusades in the name of God. Inquisition in the name of God. Ethnic cleansings throughout the world in the name of God. Terrorism in the name of God. Slavery in the name of God. And God says, I don't want you to attach my name to anything I will not attach it to. And yet, even today, as a pastor, how many stories have I heard of people who have been deeply wounded by the church or a church leader because they used God's name as their reason behind the punishment? And I'm telling you right now, if a spiritual leader does that, they are not a spiritual leader, period. Because that is precisely what God does not want. Finally, the fourth. The first 3 are what? Establishing safeguards around relationship, right? I want to be your one and only. Don't try to imitate me or represent me in any way, right? And don't attach my name to anything I haven't attached it to, right? They build trust. The 4th celebrates that relationship. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, all right? This goes deeper than just don't work, all right? Because, yeah, Sabbath means to stop. But stop and do what? Enjoy. Enjoy your relationship with God. Enjoy the relationship God has with you. Enjoy what God gave you. Celebrate God. Celebrate God's goodness. That's what worship is. That's why we worship on this day. And yeah, it's not the last day of the week. It's the first day of the week in the Western calendar. But we still take a day and we come and we celebrate the goodness of God in this space every week. And so these first 4 commandments, if you look at them, they are given out of a place of grace. God says, I choose you to be in relationship with me. God reestablishing that relationship that was already there, by the way, since the time of Abraham, since the time God even created the world in the first place. And God is still doing the same for us today. And you don't have to do anything. You can't earn it. It's already yours. That relationship is already yours. And it is yours because of grace. Because of the grace of God. I think the story of the Exodus and the Ten Commandments, it reflects something important about God's character. And we miss the relationship between God's law and our relationship with God. And if we continue to misunderstand that, you'll never understand the role of God's law in our relationship with Him. And worse, if you misunderstand the purpose of God's law in the very beginning, God's grace is ever going to remain a mystery to you, and you're just not going to get it. It's important for us to realize that God's law and God's grace both coexist, and that God's law came about because of God's grace. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's stand and sing our next song.
I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I was breathing, but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide.